was very young, and in the cave of Trophonius, I forgot to laugh. Then when I got older, when I opened my eyes and saw the real world, I began to laugh, and I haven't stopped since. I saw that the meaning of life was to get a livelihood, the goal of life was to be a high court judge, and the bright joy of love was to marry a well-off girl, and the blessing of friendship was to help each other out of a financial tight spot. That wisdom was what the majority said it was. That passion was to give a speech. That courage was to risk being fined 10 rix dollars. That cordiality was to say you're welcome after a meal, and that the fear of God was to go to communion once a year. That's what I saw, and I laughed. Søren Kierkegaard and Either Or.
Kierkegaard was a 19th century Danish philosopher and theologian. Often called the Father of Existentialism, Kierkegaard would prove to be one of the most influential and hated figures of and to postmodern philosophy. He believed that there were three stages of life: the aesthetic stage, ethical stage, and religious stage. One cannot be both aesthetic and ethical, you are either or. There is no option to bridge the gap and be part of both stages. Another instance in the separation between the stages is when Kierkegaard's pseudonym Johann de Silentio says that you must choose Athens or Jerusalem as a way of life in fear and trembling. Kierkegaard was engaged to a woman named Regine Olsen. He broke off his engagement to devote himself completely to his poeticism. In fact, the theme of a young woman being the occasion for a young man to become poeticized happens over and over again in Kierkegaard's different writings. Kierkegaard categorized himself as a religious poet above all else. A key fact is important to the complexity of Kierkegaard's relationship with Regine. After a little bit of delving into the absurd, Kierkegaard explores how Job gets everything back again by virtue of the absurd, and how Abraham doesn't have to sacrifice Isaac by virtue of the absurd. Kierkegaard hoped to get Regine back again after he broke off their engagement by virtue of the absurd as well. To no avail. For Kierkegaard, the absurd is something or a state which cannot be rationally explained.
Kierkegaard saw himself as a single universal, whose personal preoccupation with himself was transfigured by divine governance into universal significance. The distinction between good and evil, according to Kierkegaard, is ultimately dependent on God, not society. Therefore, as the pseudonym Johann de Silentio argues for Abraham, it is possible that God demand a suspension of the ethical. Kierkegaard's main advocacy of God's command metaethics is strengthened by his multiple analyses of the nuanced ways individuals need to relate to God's commands. God issuing a command is not enough to get us to follow his commands. We must obey and listen. To obey, one must cultivate faith. Obedience is a divine command that means nothing unless we at least believe the call to obedience comes from God. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says this in relation to Kierkegaard's cultivation of faith. To cultivate faith in a transcendent, eternal, omnipresent God, who allegedly became incarnate in the form of a particular human being who was put to death, requires one to overcome the offense to one's reason and to adopt a tolerance for paradox.